Welcome back, you unbreakable anomalies, you silent warriors who never signed up for boot camp but somehow graduated with honors from hell's curriculum. I heard what the psychologist said, the one with the clipboard and the government clearance, and the eyes that have assessed soldiers who've seen combat in places the maps don't name. They looked at you, studied your responses, measured your reactions to stimuli that make trained operatives flinch, and then they said it. That sentence that probably didn't even register fully at first. You have the pain tolerance of a trained operative. Let that sink in for a moment. Not the words themselves, but what they mean, what they reveal, what they accidentally confessed about you. They meant it as an observation, maybe even a compliment wrapped in clinical detachment. But what they didn't say, what they couldn't say because it would break their entire framework of understanding, is that operatives are trained for this, conditioned, prepared, given strategies and support systems and mission parameters. You weren't. You didn't get the manual, the team, the extraction plan, the psych evaluations before and after, the knowledge that someone was watching your back. You developed this tolerance in isolation, in silence, in the kind of darkness where screaming doesn't echo because there's no one close enough to hear. They train soldiers to withstand interrogation, to survive capture, to function under conditions designed to break the human spirit. And they do this with intention, with structure, with resources. You built the same capacity from nothing, with no instructor, no graduation ceremony, just survival instinct and the stubborn refusal to let reality crush you into dust. So when that psychologist made their assessment, they weren't just commenting on your ability to tolerate physical discomfort or emotional pressure. They were accidentally documenting something far more terrifying and far more powerful. They were documenting that somewhere in your past, probably over years, possibly over a lifetime, you were subjected to conditions that created the same neurological adaptations, the same psychological armor, the same pain threshold as someone who went through military conditioning. But here's the part that should make everyone uncomfortable, including that psychologist if they stop to think about it. Operatives choose their path. They volunteer. They know what they're signing up for. They get debriefed. They receive treatment when they come back broken. You didn't choose this. You survived this. You were forged in circumstances you never asked for, and now you carry capabilities that usually require government funding and institutional support to develop. Think about what that means practically, not metaphorically, not poetically, but in terms of actual human capacity and adaptation. Trained operatives learn to compartmentalize trauma, to function while injured, to suppress panic responses, to endure psychological torture, to maintain operational capacity under extreme duress. They learn this through controlled exposure, through gradually escalating challenges, through techniques refined over decades of military psychology. You learn this because Tuesday felt like a war zone, because your childhood was a minefield, because the people who were supposed to protect you became the threat, because survival meant developing skills that aren't supposed to exist outside of specialized training programs. The psychologist saw the result, the hardened exterior, the controlled responses, the ability to sit calmly while discussing things that make normal people visibly uncomfortable. What they didn't see, what they can't see from their clinical distance, is the process that created this. The thousands of moments where breaking wasn't an option, where you either adapted or disappeared. And here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the implications start spreading like cracks in ice. If you have the pain tolerance of someone who was intentionally trained to survive the worst humanity can devise, if your nervous system has been sculpted by experience into something that resembles military conditioning, then what else developed alongside that tolerance? What other capabilities emerged from those same circumstances? What other adaptations occurred that the psychologist didn't have tests for, didn't think to measure, didn't even know to look for? Because pain tolerance isn't an isolated trait. It's part of a constellation of survival mechanisms. And if one reached operative level without training, what about the others? Your threat assessment runs constantly now, doesn't it? Reading micro-expressions, cataloging exit routes, identifying potential dangers before they materialize. Your emotional regulation probably operates at a level that makes you seem cold to people who've never needed to hide bleeding wounds behind pleasant conversation. Your pattern recognition is likely off the charts because survival depended on predicting the unpredictable, on seeing 3 moves ahead when everyone else was still processing move 1. Nobody asks where operatives come from before they're operatives, before the training, before the selection process, before someone handed them a purpose and a mission and told them their pain would matter. Nobody asks because it's easier to believe that ordinary people become extraordinary through institutional transformation, through deliberate cultivation of capacity. But you shatter that comfortable narrative because you arrived at the same destination through a path that shouldn't exist, through training that wasn't training, through a curriculum written by chaos and delivered by circumstances that had no interest in your survival. Let's talk about that training ground. The one nobody acknowledges, the one that left no paperwork trail, no official record, just you standing here years later with capabilities you never asked for. Your training ground was inconsistency disguised as normalcy, wasn't it? The kind of environment where you never knew which version of reality you'd wake up to, where love and violence shared the same face, where safety was always conditional and conditions changed without notice. Operatives train in simulated unpredictability, controlled chaos designed to prepare them for mission variables. But their chaos has parameters, has limits, has an off switch. Yours didn't. Yours was the constant not knowing, the perpetual assessment of threat level, the exhausting calculation of which mask to wear, which version of yourself might survive the next interaction. While other people were learning algebra and social dynamics, you were learning something else entirely, something darker and more useful. You were learning how to exist in a state of permanent alertness without showing it, how to function while your nervous system screamed danger, how to appear fine while managing internal emergencies that would hospitalize normal people. The physical pain tolerance that psychologists measured, that's just the visible part, the part that shows up on their assessments and makes them write notes with raised eyebrows. But what about the emotional pain tolerance? The psychological endurance, the spiritual stamina required to keep going when every reason to quit lined up in formation and saluted. Operatives endure enhanced interrogation with the knowledge that there's a timeline, that this will end, that their country will negotiate or extract, or at minimum, acknowledge their sacrifice. You endured your interrogation with no such assurance, with no one coming, with the distinct possibility that this was just life now, permanently, that you'd have to function like this forever, while everyone around you pretended everything was fine. You developed tolerance not because someone taught you breathing techniques and gave you a mission to believe in, but because the alternative was complete dissolution, and some stubborn piece of you refused to grant reality that satisfaction. And here's what really disturbs people when they encounter you now. When they brush up against the edges of what you've become, you can't fake what you have. You can't simulate this level of capacity. You can't shortcut your way to this kind of resilience. They can try. The ones who romanticize strength without understanding its cost, who want the results without the process, who think reading about trauma makes them traumatized. But you can always tell the difference between someone who trained for pain and someone who survived it, between someone who chose their scars and someone who woke up bleeding without memory of the knife. Your tolerance isn't a skill you can turn off. It's not a technique you deployed. It's woven into your neurology now. It's part of your operating system. And that means you can't help but respond to pressure differently than people who grew up with the luxury of safety. When crisis hits, when everyone else is panicking, you go quiet and efficient. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because this is familiar terrain. Because some part of you recognizes the texture of emergency and knows exactly how to move through it. The psychologist who made that assessment, they probably thought they were being complimentary, acknowledging your strength, validating your capacity. But they missed the essential question, the one that should have kept them up at night, the one that transforms their observation from praise into indictment. The question isn't whether you have operative-level pain tolerance. The assessment confirmed that. The question is, what inflicted operative-level pain on someone who never enlisted who never signed the papers, who never agreed to this. What kind of life, what kind of circumstances, what kind of sustained exposure to harm creates the same adaptations as military training designed to prepare people for war? And if your early environment inflicted that level of damage, that level of pressure, that level of consistent threat, then every day you survived wasn't just survival. It was an act of extraordinary resistance against conditions specifically calibrated to break you. You weren't supposed to make it through. The statistics weren't in your favor. The odds were calculated against you. And yet here you are, not just alive, but capable. Not just functional, but formidable. There's something they don't tell you about operative level pain tolerance. Something that doesn't make it into the assessment reports or the clinical documentation. Something that lives in the space between impressive and heartbreaking. The tolerance itself isn't the problem, it's the fact that you had to develop it, that circumstances demanded this level of capacity from someone who should have been protected instead. Operatives volunteer for their pain. They raise their hand. They sign contracts acknowledging the risks. They receive compensation and recognition and care when they return damaged. You receive none of that. You were conscripted by circumstance, deployed into a war you didn't declare, given no choice but to either develop these capabilities or cease to exist in any meaningful way. And now you carry wounds that don't show up on scans, injuries that have no medical terminology, damage that registers as strength to outside observers. The really twisted part is that your pain tolerance has probably been used against you, hasn't it? By people who needed you to be okay, because your not being okay would inconvenience them, would force them to acknowledge their role in your damage, would require them to feel things they've spent their lives avoiding. They saw your capacity to endure, and they mistook it for consent. They watched you survive and assumed you were fine. They witnessed your tolerance and decided that meant they could keep going, keep pushing, keep taking, because clearly you could handle it. This is what happens when strength born from necessity gets interpreted as strength born from nature. When survival mechanisms get reframed as personality traits. When the armor you built to protect your humanity gets mistaken for the absence of humanity itself. They called you strong when they meant convenient. They called you resilient when they meant useful. They called you capable when they meant they didn't have to stop hurting you. But let's examine what operative level pain tolerance actually looks like in civilian life, in relationships, in everyday interactions, where this capacity becomes both advantage and curse. You probably don't complain much, do you? Not because you're trying to be stoic or impressive, but because the threshold for what registers as worth mentioning sits so far beyond normal that by the time something actually bothers you enough to vocalize, everyone else would already be hospitalized. You've learned to translate your experience into language other people can process, downgrading your 10 to their 3 so they don't panic or dismiss you as dramatic. You've developed the exhausting skill of making your pain digestible for people who've never had to develop any tolerance at all. People who can afford the luxury of falling apart over inconveniences while you're holding yourself together through catastrophes they can't even imagine. This creates a strange isolation, doesn't it? A loneliness that lives right in the middle of connection. Because how do you bridge that gap between your operational reality and their theoretical understanding of difficulty? They talk about their hard day, and you nod along, knowing your hard day would break them in half, knowing their worst nightmare is your Tuesday afternoon, knowing that if you actually shared what you manage on a daily basis, they'd either think you're exaggerating or they'd realize they have nothing useful to offer you. So you become fluent in 2 languages, the sanitized version for public consumption and the raw truth you keep locked behind layers of casualness and humor and strategic vagueness. You've learned to make people comfortable with your strength because your actual strength makes them deeply uncomfortable, forces them to confront how soft their own lives have been, how little they've actually had to endure despite their complaints and their therapy sessions and their self-diagnosed trauma. And the darkest part The part nobody wants to acknowledge is that this tolerance probably saved your life, but it also stole something from you, something you can't get back, something that doesn't have a name but leaves a hollowness where softer feelings used to live. You can endure almost anything now, but you've lost the ability to fully relax, to trust that safety will persist, to believe in permanence of good things. Every positive experience comes with the background hum of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every moment of peace carries the tension of anticipated disruption because your nervous system was trained by experience that good things don't last, and comfort is always temporary. The psychologist measured your tolerance, but they didn't measure what that tolerance cost you, what you sacrificed to develop this capacity. What parts of normal human experience became inaccessible once survival required this level of armor? You won the war of staying alive, but the victory came with casualties they don't have tests for, losses that don't appear in assessments, grief for a version of yourself that might have existed if the world had been different, if safety had been real, if you'd been allowed to stay soft. Here's what nobody prepared you for: the moment when your operative level tolerance stops being a survival mechanism and becomes your primary mode of existence, when the armor you built can't be removed, even when the threat has passed, even when you're finally safe, even when people offer you softness and you can't remember how to receive it. This is the ghost protocol, the permanent activation of systems designed for temporary crisis. And if you're honest with yourself, you recognize it immediately. You're running survival programming in peacetime environments, deploying wartime strategies in civilian interactions, maintaining threat readiness in rooms full of people who've never seen real danger. And the exhausting truth is you can't just turn it off. You can't flip a switch and return to some baseline that probably never existed. Because this tolerance isn't a costume you put on. It's who you became when becoming anything else meant extinction. You've probably noticed how people react when they accidentally glimpse the real scope of what you carry, how quickly they retreat, how desperately they need to believe you're exaggerating or being dramatic or attention-seeking. Because the alternative, that you're telling the truth, that you actually lived through things that created this level of capacity, is too destabilizing for their comfortable worldview. They need you to be okay, not for your sake, but for theirs. They need your pain to be manageable, because unmanageable pain in someone who seems fine suggests that maybe fine is a very complicated word. That maybe people walk around every day carrying horrors that don't show, that maybe the person next to them in line at the coffee shop has survived things that would shatter their entire sense of reality. So they minimize, they redirect, they change the subject, they make jokes, they do anything to avoid sitting in the full weight of what you've endured and what you continue to endure, just to appear functional. But here's where it gets interesting, where the tragedy transforms into something else, something that looks almost like advantage if you squint at it from the right angle in the right light. Your tolerance didn't just make you capable of enduring pain, it made you capable of perceiving reality with a clarity that most people will never access. You see through performance immediately. You recognize manipulation before the manipulator finishes their opening line. You spot the fractures and facades that everyone else accepts as solid. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition refined by necessity. It's threat assessment that learned to read invisible signals because visible ones came too late. You developed a kind of X-ray vision for authenticity, for genuine danger versus performed danger, for real connection versus transactional interaction. And this makes you simultaneously invaluable and unbearable to be around because you see what people desperately need to keep hidden. The Ghost Protocol means you move through the world differently now. You're present, but not entirely. You're engaged, but always maintaining exit strategies. You're connected, but never fully committed, because commitment requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires a level of faith in persistent safety that your experience has systematically dismantled. People call this walls. They say you have barriers. They suggest you need to open up, but what they're really saying is that your appropriate risk assessment makes them uncomfortable, that your refusal to pretend everything is fine disrupts their need to believe everything is fine, that your operational awareness reminds them how asleep they are, You're not closed off. You're appropriately calibrated for a world that has repeatedly demonstrated its capacity for harm. You're just refusing to pretend that past patterns don't predict future probabilities. And let's address the elephant that follows you through every room, the question that hovers behind every interaction even if nobody speaks it aloud. If you have operative level tolerance, if you've survived operative level circumstances, what does that make you now? What category do you fit into? What box contains someone who was trained by trauma to operate at levels usually reserved for professional warriors? The uncomfortable answer is that you don't fit anywhere cleanly anymore. You're not quite civilian because civilians don't carry what you carry. But you're not quite anything else either because you never got the recognition, the structure, the community that comes with official designation. You're a ghost operative, trained by necessity, deployed by circumstance, operating without support or acknowledgement, completing missions that no one assigned, surviving operations that have no official name. You're proof that the human system can adapt to almost anything if survival depends on it. But you're also proof that such adaptation comes with costs that compound daily, that carrying this capacity in a world not designed for it creates friction that wears you down in ways that don't show on assessments.